We are. It is finally November 3, 2020, a day that we have been anticipating for several months. I'm sure that most of you have already voted, but as Kim said, if you haven't, please make sure you do so. I would like to just recognize the fact that several HASP members are not able to be with us this morning because they are volunteering their time and services at local polls. So thank you to them. Our monthly program committee puts much thought and time into planning appropriate presentations. So it is no coincidence that this month's program will feature the history of the struggle for women's rights to vote. However, it probably is a coincidence that our meeting is on a presidential election day. It is also fair to say that when the election results are in, some people will be happy and some people will be disappointed. During our fall term, we have had several curriculum courses related to politics and the election, including the ongoing course, Cultivating Civility, which focuses on ways in which we can interact and share, which focuses on ways in which we can interact with people who disagree with us. A week or so ago, Kim sent us a constant contact in which she shared that during these unprecedented and stressful times, it is important that as HASP members, we respect and practice the virtues of public discourse. We display these in our classrooms, and now at this particular time, we would like to encourage you to read them again. You can find them on our website under Member Resources. After today's presentation, whether you are a man or a woman, you will no doubt have a greater appreciation for the privilege of voting, which we now take for granted, but came after many years of dedication by brave and inspired women. This year, we celebrate the 100th anniversary of the culmination of the suffragette movement, the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which gives all of us the right, privilege, and responsibility to vote as we wish. And now a big thank you goes to our Special Events Committee for a successful trivia night, which was held last week. HASP members are really missing the social contact that we usually enjoy through special events. The committee worked very hard to plan this first remote social event, and we're looking forward to more innovative gatherings while we patiently wait for the time when we once again can be together in person. Curriculum courses have been going well. Both registration and attendance have been very good. However, there are still a lot of great courses scheduled for November and early December. Of specific interest and related to today's program is a 2-session course, A Woman's Place Under the Dome. The course will be presented by Valerie Marvin, the historian and curator of the Michigan State Capitol. The first session on November 30 will address Capitol women, early female clerks, librarians, janitresses, and legislators. And on December 7, suffrage at the seat of state government. So take another look at the calendar and sign up for a couple of more courses. Remember, you can register for courses throughout the term. We just ask that you register 24 hours before the scheduled class time. Finally, I would like to say just a few words about the decision that was made by the COVID-19 subcommittee. Hopefully you read the November newsletter and learned that the committee recommends that HASP classes monthly programs, and other activities take place remotely for the winter-spring term of 2021. This decision was made with the health and safety of our members as a priority. Also taken into consideration was Hope College's plans for their second semester, which will basically be a continuation of the fall semester's practices and protocols. We expect that Kim and Susan will be able to continue working in the HASP office on Tuesdays and Thursdays. After the committee made this decision, the data showing increased cases in our county, state, and country only reinforced our belief that this is the right decision for us at this time. We will continue to be informed with data from the college, the state of Michigan, and the CDC throughout the winter-spring term. You will be the first to know if we alter our plans. Once again, we thank you for your cooperation and your support as we move into 2021, anticipating that at some point we will be able to be together in our beautiful new facility. And now Carla Verskure, Chairperson of Membership, will introduce today's guests and new members.
Good morning, HASP members. It's wonderful to be able to spend this time together, even if it is virtual. We also have 5 guests with us today that we would like to welcome. So join me in welcoming Deborah Koopman, Mary Claren, Joyce and Chad Schmucker, and Ellen Westveer. Thank you, our guests, for choosing to join us this morning as well. It's also my privilege to introduce 4 new members to HASP membership. So please give a HASP welcome to Linda Byrne, Mary Jo Kiefer, Russell Kiefer, and Marie Santander Wolfson. We're happy to have you join our membership, and we look forward to the time when we can actually meet you in person. Welcome to all of you.
Thank you, Carla. Yes, and welcome to all our guests and members. We're anxious to actually be able to see you someday. Before I leave you all this morning, on behalf of the HASP Board, I would like to wish you all a very special Thanksgiving Day. Certainly, this year's holidays will be celebrated differently than we normally do. In whatever way you celebrate, we hope that you, all of us, will focus on the good and positive things in our lives which we can enjoy. Family, friends, home, health, happiness, and HASP. Thanksgiving to you all. Now, Claudia Berry, Chairperson of our monthly program committee, will introduce this morning's guest speaker. Claudia?
Thank you, Barbara. Good morning, everyone. As we thought about November 3rd and our program actually falling on Election Day, several choices popped into our mind, but many of us on the committee thought that the best choice would to look back and look at how Grand Rapids made, and particularly women in Grand Rapids, made the final push in 1918 to get the vote. We thought this would not be too controversial a topic since it's already happened. So this morning we have a wonderful speaker to take us back to that time when the suffragette movement culminated with a campaign in 1980 before that November referendum asking male voters to amend the Michigan Constitution. The suffragettes in Grand Rapids engaged in powerful tactics, including interpersonal methods, lobbying, legislative candidates, contacting clergy, visiting factories, running booths at state fairs, but also they ran a very creative paper campaign through the newspapers. The success in Michigan inspired the national campaign for the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920, 100 years ago. And as you know, the League of Women Voters is also celebrating their 100th anniversary. Today, to take us back and explain and share with us all the tactics the suffragettes used is Katelyn Bosch VerMerris. Katelyn received her MA from West Virginia University in 2018, emphasizing public history, after she had a BA from Calvin College. She researches many local topics, including the Grand Rapids unit of the Women's Committee of the Council of National Defense in World War I. Currently, she is the development manager at Resthaven in Holland. She also continues her work as a freelance researcher, writer, and is the recording secretary for the board of the Greater Grand Rapids Women's History Council, which is where our committee, through the help of Jo Ellen, who runs that executive director, found Katelyn. So we are thrilled to have Katelyn speak with us today. And I just want you all to join me in welcoming Katelyn VerMerris. Thank you.
Thanks, Claudia. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here on what is going to be an exciting day for all of us. So we can take a look back in the past to help get through the day. Let me quick share my screen with you all. I have a presentation. There we go. So like Claudia said, I am on the board of the Greater Grand Rapids Women's History Council. We are a group who is dedicated to educating the community and celebrating the legacies of local women. We emphasize preserving knowledge, but also using that knowledge to inspire visions for the future. In 2020, it's our big suffrage year, as is the centennial of the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote federally. We had planned a big celebration on Equality Day. However, as we've all experienced this year, plans change. So we're focusing on just trying to share what we have collected through educational programming and other ways. So I have to make a nod to the men and women on the board with me, who a lot of my contextual information came from the hard work they put into researching this. So today we are going to talk about the suffrage movement as a whole, but also specifically the final push in 1918 that gave women in Michigan the right to vote 2 years before the federal amendment passed. So we are going to start broad and kind of narrow into the local story in Grand Rapids.
Katelyn, this is Kim Mendels. For some reason, part of your slideshow screen is partially.
Oh.
Here we go. Thank you. Better now. I don't know what just happened. I can see the whole thing now.
Thank you for chiming in.
There you go. Okay, we're good.
Good. Thank you. Okay, so starting with the national story. I know you all probably know a lot or a little about this. You're familiar. So starting with, we all learned in school about the Seneca Falls Convention and the generation of notable leaders, including Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. We learn about the post-Civil War era, which brought complicated relationships between the suffrage movement and the civil rights movement, who were also pushing for suffrage for African Americans. And we learn into the 21st century as it's tied up with the progressive era and temperance and other progressive issues. So this narrative is really important to our national histories and our idea of American citizenship. More recently also, though, there's a push to recognize the role of grassroots movements in getting suffrage to pass. Many women's organizations in the progressive era worked by having a national branch, and then they had state branch and then local branches. So this is also true of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, which I will often refer to as NAWSA. So it takes the feet on the ground in order to share these ideas. And this is why knowing the local story is so important, because there wouldn't be a national story without the local story. So I'm going to start by providing a little bit of context to the Michigan and the Grand Rapids movement. So in Michigan, women had the right to vote in school elections starting in 1867. Well, tax-paying women had the right to vote in school elections, which basically means property owning women. So that's a trend you see with suffrage, that the elite get it first. And so nationally, when the Constitution was written, you had predominantly property owning men who could vote, and then it expanded to white men. And then in 1870, the 15th Amendment gave Black men the constitutional right to vote, whether they could or not, based on what's happening on the ground. So the same thing happened here in Michigan with women. It started with, in school elections, tax-paying women could vote in 1867. And in 1881, this law expanded to include women with school-age children. So it's significant that women can now vote for the leadership in schools where their children attended. So as women were supposed to be the light keepers of the home and children, many women wanted to vote for what was happening in the schools where their children went. They could also start running for school council at the time, which was also important to make sure they were part of the leadership. In the 1880s and 1890s, this was an active time for the suffrage movement in Michigan. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony traveled extensively in Michigan, and they personally organized suffrage activity wherever they went. So this included some familiar cities like Frankfort, Grand Rapids, Ludington, Saugatuck. In 1889, the National American Suffrage Association came to Grand Rapids. The Grand Rapids invitation came from a prominent suffragist, Emily Burton Ketchum, and it was accepted over many larger cities. Emily Burton Ketchum was a pioneer in the women's suffrage movement. She had over 30 years of involvement, both statewide and nationally, and in Grand Rapids. She was an eloquent communicator. She was a passionate activist. She was a skilled organizer. She was called, quote, the greatest worker Michigan ever produced, end quote, by friend and fellow suffragist Anna Howard Shaw. It was because of her connection to the national suffrage movement, particularly her friendship with Susan B. Anthony, that Grand Rapids was chosen to host in 1889. They hosted it at St. Cecilia in Grand Rapids. Also, a side note, Emily Burton Ketchum is related to Barney Burton, which is where my alma mater, Calvin University, resides on Burton Street. Burton Street was named after her uncle, Barney Burton. Barney Burton was the first white man recorded married in Grand Rapids. I just wanted to throw in that tangent to mention Calvin, so you can all be a little prejudiced against me. A notable event at this convention was the resolution which brought forward African-American suffragist Lottie Wilson Jackson. She was a delegate of Bay City. She was an artist and an activist. She's pictured on the right on my slide. She asked delegates to address the indignities her Black sisters suffered in their travels to support the suffrage cause. She cited uncleanly and unsafe conditions. This was met with some opposition, particularly from Susan B. Anthony, who dismissed this issue, saying that it's just not worth talking about right now. So going into 1910, a new leadership in the movement was rising after the passing of Emily Burton Ketchum. In 1910, the Grand Rapids Equal Franchise Club founded with Clara Comstock Russell at the head. She would be a leader in the suffrage movement for decades following, including in the 1918 referendum that we talk about. The club debuted at the homecoming parade with a brilliant float pictured on the slide. Eva McCall Hamilton and Al Blake were also promising leaders who are present on that float. In 1912 and 1913, there were also referendums to amend the Michigan Constitution for women statewide, and districts organized for both of these similarly to 1918. They appointed headquarters, they distributed flyers and media, and they worked to gain allies. However, they lost both of those referendums. Pictured is on the left is the headquarters in the 1912 election. The picture has many big names in the local suffrage movement, many movers and shakers, just to name a few. You have Fern Richardson Rowe, who was the recording secretary. You have the city campaign chair, Eva McCall Hamilton, and the publicity chair, Auld Louise Blake, and her state campaign secretary, Claire Comstock Russell, mentioned above. Another notable event in suffrage history in Grand Rapids was the takeover of the Grand Rapids Press in 1914. Suffrage leader Alice Paul put out a call to local agencies saying, we need to make some noise. We need to do some big things to show that women want this vote. So there was this part of this cohesive plan to demonstrate the voices of men and women wanting suffrage. The picture on the top right shows the masthead of this edition of the Grand Rapids Press. It shows all the states who have the vote already. And in the very back, you see Michigan in chains lagging behind. And on the graphic on the bottom is one of my favorites from this edition. It shows some prominent male leaders at the time and where they stand on the suffrage question. So you have a couple in front, you have many just kind of lagging somewhere in the middle, not committing, and then you have a man firmly behind the fence. In May 1917, women are granted the right to vote in presidential elections in what is called the Damon Flower Act. So pictured here on the left is Governor Albert Sleeper. He's signing the bill that gives women the right to vote federally, because this doesn't take a state amendment as it's talking about federal elections. And as shown on the right, it's a map that was printed in the Charlevoix County Herald. It shows that even though Michigan is already an outlier, in the East, so you have the Western states that are white, have full suffrage, and Michigan's kind of an outlier where we have partial suffrage. It wasn't enough. We were still pushing for the full suffrage vote. So the countdown begins after that is signed for 1918, as that was also the time where they approved that they were going to vote again in the next year for the referendum to amend the Constitution. So I don't talk too specifically about Holland in this presentation, but I did want to spend a minute talking about some specifics of what I found on the movement in Holland. So pictured here are some suffragists marching in Holland, although I'm not sure which year this picture is. Somebody, if they've seen it before, can enlighten me at the end, maybe. In 1912, Holland chartered the Holland Equal Suffrage Club under the Michigan Equal Suffrage Association. An article in 1916 said that the club was growing very fast. In 1917, Mrs. Clark, who was the president of the State Equal Suffrage League, addressed Hope College, and she urged her audience to join these brave pioneers and to do all that is possible to bring about the first approaching Reformation. And at this time, a suffrage association was also organized at Hope College that was very active in 1916 and 17. Yeah, many in Holland did still oppose suffrage. Historically, they voted against it. When Ottawa County voted on suffrage in 1912, male voters in the county had voted 4,600, nay, and only 2,700 were for it. So the Holland City News reported that Hollanders were, quote, much averse to women's suffrage. After the passage of the 19th Amendment, Robert P. Swearinga, which many of you will recognize as a prominent Holland historian, he quoted a Holland woman in his books saying, Holland women will yet again be able to vote in spite of their husbands who did their best to keep them from the ballot, end quote. So moving forward, we're heading into the year 1918 and what was going on at that time to push for the referendum on November 5. So I wanted to highlight, give credit to a source where we get a lot of what we know about this push. So this was the Women's Citizen. It is the publishing arm of NASA. And this edition contained detailed reports from different districts in Michigan about their efforts leading up to the referendum as kind of a review of how it went. So it was focused on reporting the success of the campaign after the campaign happened. The Grand Rapids article was written by Grace Ames Vinhausen. She was a prominent activist and she was called the first businesswoman to enter politics. She was elected as the campaign chair for the local World War I Women's Committee of the Council of National Defense. And she was also the state's Equal Suffrage Association chair of the Women in Industry Committee. So in 1918, the campaign in Michigan launched with the headquarters in Detroit, and they had local chairs over each district, which was a familiar model. They had to supply 82 counties with print material and use that to spread the word. It was reported that this was more difficult than it was first apparent, since parcel posts as well as express facilities were congested. A challenge that the suffrage movement had from the beginning was that Michigan was home to both urban and quite rural areas. They had to have messaging that resonated with both an urban audience, and they also had to have the transportation that would reach rural areas. So they cited unreliable trains and lack of cars to get to some of the more remote places. So as some context, in 1918, as you may know, it was a globally tumultuous year. It was the end of World War I. The war actually ends on November 11, which is just 6 days after this vote. So the campaign truly happened in conjunction with women working for the war as well. You see this time and time again. The war provided a challenge because it was the first priority, and so the suffraging message was tricky, but ultimately women did leverage this to show their value in society. So women's organizations already were a prominent vehicle for collective action, but they really rallied during World War I to support the war at home, and some did go abroad too. They planted victory gardens, they organized knitting campaigns, they led children's programs, and much more. So organizations like the Women's Committee of the Council of National Defense and the Red Cross organized women all over the state to do volunteer work for the war. In fact, perhaps the largest endeavor undertaken was to register a campaign for the Women's Committee. They registered over 23,000 women for war work in Grand Rapids, pictured as one of the cards that they used to register women. These cards demonstrate mass willingness to support the war effort. A little note, if you're interested in genealogy or have any particular women you want to look up, the Grand Rapids Public Library has these cards and they're digitized on their website. So they have a lot of detail into women's lives, including their occupation, any skills that they have, their address, their education level, and many, many, many more tidbits. So outside of the increase in volunteer work, there was also an increase in women in labor. As men were enlisted, are redirected, their positions in factories needed to be filled. And in some fields, women were actively encouraged to take up these positions. So statistics from the Michigan Labor Bureau show that in 1917, there were 1,155 women employed in Grand Rapids. By 1920, that number had grown 6 times to 6,504. The most significant jump was factory workers, which grew from only 60 women in 1917 to 300 women by 1920. And notably, the 1917 report also contained only 7 positions where women were working, and by 1920, there were 22 positions. Additionally, women also found further opportunities to get professional training. One of the most common trainings available was for nursing. Nursing leaders created trainings that helped prepare for the shortage of nurses anticipated during the war, including Minnie Blodgett, who created the Vassar Training Camp in 1917 for nurse development. The Vassar Training Camp prepared over 400 women for a nursing career, which is something that they could take with them after the war. So what you see in these 2 images here is a visual representation of women participating in the public sphere in ways that they were unaccustomed to seeing before World War I. So the pictures show women in coveralls, they show them wearing nurses' uniforms. And so this was a visual indicator that women were entering more into the labor world previously only occupied by men. The cartoon on the screen was printed in the Women's Citizen in an earlier edition before the suffrage report that we talk about a lot. So it shows the political parties balancing their rhetoric about how women are needed to fill labor gaps, but not needed enough to be full citizens with the vote. In their report on the Women's Citizen Victory Edition, the 3rd and 4th Congressional District, which is kind of the middle of the state, also, they talk about how the war affected their campaign specifically. They said it was hard to fundraise because the suffrage movement was considered less important than the war movement. So it was considered unpatriotic to fundraise for anything but the war at the time. The author of this article, Dr. Blanche Haynes, also argued that suffrage was just as patriotic as the war because the fight for suffrage was also the fight for democracy. So she disagreed that it was unpatriotic. In 1917, the Grand Rapids Equal Franchise Club also sent a letter to Woodrow Wilson, which said, quote, "The Grand Rapids Equal Franchise Club of over 1,000 members unites with the National Women's Suffrage Association in urging you to use your active support to bring about a federal amendment for equal suffrage as an immediate war measure. To a large number of thinking women in America, the granting of the franchise to women by the federal amendment would be a pledge of sincerity and integrity in our great war for democracy." End quote. Woodrow Wilson would formally support suffrage in early 1918, even though he was on the fence before that. And in September of 1918, he said in a speech, quote, "We have made partners of women in this war. Shall we then admit them only as a partner of sacrifice and toil, but not as a partner of privilege and right?" So Wilson's support was considered instrumental in pushing the 19th Amendment through Congress. By January of 1918, the House had actually already passed a suffrage amendment, so the Michigan referendum was happening alongside this national battle. Michigan women also appealed to men locally by calling upon the contributions of women in the war effort. So pictured here is a cartoon by Gert Van Houten. She reminded women of the essential work that women had taken since 1917 to preserve democracy. And again, here you see women in different garbs that visually show their participation in the war effort and going into different spheres than previously. Another phenomenon that is gaining more attention this year because of the modern times is the 1918 flu pandemic. So the pandemic did affect the late campaign in October because there was a quarantine statewide shutdown in Michigan. So churches were asked not to meet, large gatherings were banned, and people were encouraged to stay home in October due to this pandemic. Does that sound familiar? The 3rd and 4th districts did report that it had been a quiet campaign because they had to cancel all their speakers in October. So they could only use print. So they weren't able to use at the end of the campaign some of their normal tactics. Yet the pandemic did not cause the permanent delay in the outcome, as we see. So I think it is particularly encouraging to note that during 1918, all this work did happen amidst a pandemic and global upheaval. And they were able to push through and keep their sight on their goals and continue to do things and get work done. So now I want to talk a little bit about the why. So looking at the arguments of why should women be able to vote, or why should women not be able to vote, as people in 1918 viewed it. So looking at newspapers, you do get some good insights into the arguments on both sides of the referendum. So the suffragists had been arguing for equal rights for more than 80 years. And so 1918 did bring some familiar arguments, but they also had some timely ones. So first, they argued that the majority of women wanted the vote. In the West, women were already voting, and Michigan women were just as intelligent as them, so why should they not be able to vote as well? Additionally, this was by November a bipartisan issue, as both the Republican and Democratic Party had supported the issue at their conventions. So secondly, they kept using the phrase suffrage as a war measure. So they said, we're fighting a war for democracy overseas, but at home, we're still denying half our population the right to vote. That there's a disconnect there. They also talked about how women were being asked to serve in labor and other areas. However, they're not giving a voice in what that looks like. So Mrs. Blakesley wrote an op-ed in a Berrien County newspaper that said, quote, 1.5 million women have been taken from their home duties and put to industrial centers controlled by the government. These women and every woman of the United States should have a voice in controlling of that government what controls their labor, end quote. So this touches on the third point, which is that women are in charge of the home, and voting will give them a greater power to protect their children and advocate for legislation that's best for their families. So suffrage is not about taking women out of the home, they argued. It's about their ability to protect the home stronger. I also found an interesting op-ed that used data from countries that allowed women to vote, saying that the infant mortality rate is lower. An article published in Benton Harbor said that the US's infant mortality rate was 300,000. 5 countries had a lower rate at the time. They were New Zealand, France, Norway, Australia, and Sweden, and all of them had full suffrage for women. So the argument goes that when women are consulted as mothers, they can better protect their babies. And his article, even interestingly, translated the infant mortality rate to dollars to show the loss of productivity the US is having because of the infant mortality rate. So into the anti-suffragists. Because we know what happened in 1918, it's easy to look back at the suffragists as the heroes who inevitably would win. However, I do think it's important to look at women in context and understand the anti-suffrage perspective as well. And the first point is actually the exact same as the suffragists' point. They said that the silent majority of women don't want the vote. So suffragists are a vocal population, they said, and they don't speak for the masses. Looking at the local papers, there does seem to be a lot of public support for suffrage. However, the Women's Citizen did say that anti-suffragists were having a hard time getting print time at newspapers because a lot of newspapers supported suffrage. So I'm not sure where the majority was. Point number 2 is that because of the war, this is actually not the right time to push for suffrage, because women's contributions, they argued, weren't actually real work. They said that was propaganda from the suffrage organizations. And they said they were utilizing their war work to leverage the war to get suffrage, which was unethical. They also found some of the demonstrations you see nationally in DC and the UK to be off-putting. And also they said because the soldier boys were overseas and can't vote easily, it's not fair or just to hold the vote when they are overseas. There's also some rhetoric that said that suffrage, it was pro-German and socialist, which is interesting because in the Women's Citizen, the suffragists had an article about how they worried that the pro-German vote in Saginaw would hurt their ability to win. So you just see the ideology of socialism and the war playing into each other's arguments. Point number 3 is that women are responsible for the home and suffrage will impede their domestic duty. So the merging of gender roles will negatively affect society, they thought. They thought that as nonpartisans, women would have more power to unite and to reform. I also found some arguments about the, quote, indifferent vote. So this was saying that women, when they get the vote, they probably won't use it anyways. So what's the point of fighting for the vote? So going into the launch of the official Final Push campaign, on May 1st, the campaign launched formally from the Michigan Equal Suffrage Association. The National Suffrage field organizers came into different locales in order to guide them and to give input into what tactics to use. So in Grand Rapids, national organizer Nettie Rogers Schultz, they came and she urged area suffragists to adopt a comprehensive political organization and to gather petition signatures to offer proof of widespread support for the cause. So in June, Grand Rapids opened their headquarters at 127th Ottawa Avenue. They share the space with the Kent County Equal Suffrage Association and the 5th Congressional District Suffrage Association. So one of the first things they did was seek to get endorsements from people who held weight in the community. So nationally, suffrage already had the endorsement of President Wilson, and they also had the endorsement of the Michigan governor at the time, who was Albert Sleeper. Governor Sleeper also cited war work like Wilson as an important reason why women had earned the vote. He also called upon their sacrifice in giving up their sons and husbands for the war. So they had some high powers nationally and at state level, but they still had work to be done locally to get some endorsements from prominent local influencers. So part of this was securing votes from legislators. They called all the candidates for legislator. They sent letters And they wouldn't stop contacting them until they got a declaration of what their position was on suffrage. In Grand Rapids, they ultimately gained pledges from 22 out of 26 candidates. They also worked hard to get endorsements from clergy, as religion played a big role in people's voting choices. So the suffrage club campaign did gain momentum by getting endorsements from prominent local clergy, one of them being Catholic Bishop Michael Gallagher, Episcopal Bishop John McCormick, and 2 Christian Reformed pastors. The Christian Reformed endorsement held extra weight because the Christian Reformed Dutch population had been cited with blamed for past defeats, like we talked about in Holland, how they had been historically opposed because of their background. So all over the state, clergy did give their support for the suffrage referendum. A prominent pastor in Detroit said, quote, "In the kingdom of God, there is no discrimination between male and female. Conscience and capacity are the gauge of leadership. So it must be in our kingdoms of this world. If they are to become the kingdoms of God and his Christ, who dares say that women should no longer be denied the share of responsibilities in government?" So while suffrage leaders did credit clergy endorsement as a factor, not all clergy were on board. There were still many voices against it. A prominent national Catholic bishop, James Cardinal Gibbons, said, quote, "Woman is queen, indeed, but her empire is the domestic kingdom. Her greatest political triumphs she would achieve in public life fade into insignificance compared with the serene glory which radiates from the domestic shrine, which she illuminates and warms by her conjugal and motherly values." So again, some different voices. They also made some public demonstrations in order to show how many people wanted the vote and to put it out in front of people. They went to county fairs with banners that read "Vote Yes" on November 5 for women's suffrage. They marched in the Labor Day parade. That's what's pictured on the screen. These public demonstrations are a familiar tactic to the movement, from the parade to the 1918 movement, but it does have more relevant messaging and timing. So I want to highlight some of the messages on these signs. On the second to the left one, it said, "Let our mothers vote." A common criticism was that voting would impede a woman's ability to support her family. So here's an example of some language that appeal to that, saying that winning the vote will actually allow women to be better mothers. They also delivered literature and posters all over Grand Rapids. They simply saturated the city with paper. In October, they put 2 cards for the referendum in every Grand Rapids interurban car. On this letter are 2 examples. I'm not actually sure if these are from 1918, but they're from one of the suffrage referendums, so it's an example. So it shows some of the rhetoric and arguments that they put on these cards that they distributed. They also rented out 40 storefronts and they put posters on the storefront. So as you walk down the street, you can't miss it. There's posters, there's postcards, there's paper everywhere. And they visited 100 different factories and they secured promises for the vote. And they also filled them with suffrage posters and leaflets. The Equal Suffrage Association also launched the intensive campaign to get signatures for a petition like was recommended. In the first month, Grand Rapids secured 13,267 signatures, and they expected that they could have gotten more if they could have done another tour of the city, but they were too busy with war work to do a second round. So by the summer, they had 14,000 signatures from Grand Rapids. The Michigan petition had 202,000 signatures, and this was reported as the largest number of signatures ever presented to the Michigan Senate to that date. In the days before the election, the names of the petition filled 3 different newspapers because no one newspaper could print the full list. So on November 1st, the Morning News printed 1/3 of the names. On November 2nd, the Grand Rapids Press printed another 1/3, which is what is pictured on the screen. And on November 3rd, the Grand Rapids Herald finished out the list. Grace Van Housen said that it was the talk of the town and a most convincing method of showing that Grand Rapids women did want the vote. So on November 5, Michigan men go to the polls to decide if women had earned the right to vote, and the moment passes. So in Grand Rapids, the Equal Suffrage Association had placed 2 women at each voting precinct that gave voters tags that said, "I am an American citizen, I have voted." And they ran the results back to the headquarters as soon as they could. In November, or in 1912 and 1913, the referendums, Grand Rapids had voted against them. In 1918, however, they passed it. They received the news at 1:30 a.m. and headquarters was full, waiting for that news that Grand Rapids had passed it. Grand Rapids had carried it by a margin of over 500 votes. In total, the referendum passed with 229,790 votes. This equaled 54%. So it's important to note that 195,000 about voted against it. So this huge goal was achieved, but the work was not done. Indeed, there's the longer work of winning the hearts for women's rights and suffrage, but there was some immediate work also. So there was, now we needed to register all the women so they could go vote. And also there was a movement to educate women on civics so that they voted well and could participate well with this new privilege. And also, perhaps most importantly, not all women in the country had the same right. So as was printed in the Women's Citizen, with 15 full states in line, now we need a long, strong pull together for the federal amendment. The map on the screen shows which states have full women's suffrage going into August of 1920. And you'll see again that Michigan is a bit of an outlier in the East and in the Midwest, and that it's the only state other than New York that has full suffrage rights. The Western states were kind of the leaders in granting full suffrage, with Wyoming being the first. They entered the U.S. as a territory in 1869 with women's suffrage intact. And then when they entered as a state in 1890, they became the first state to also have women's suffrage. The Michigan suffragists continued to advocate at the national level. In June 1919, the suffrage bill passed Congress, and Michigan was one of the first states to ratify it on June 10. But suffragists had to still continue to travel and to lobby for over a year to get enough states to ratify the amendment on August 26th of 1920, which is when we celebrate Equality Day now. The right to vote in Michigan also corresponds with the right to run for state offices. So Eva McCall Hamilton became the first woman elected to the legislature when she won the Grand Rapids seat in the state Senate in 1920. And she only lasted a term, and her seat wasn't filled again until 2012 when Winnie Brinks was elected for Grand Rapids. So very lastly, I just want to highlight some resources if you want to learn more or if you're inspired to do any research yourself. So the Greater Grand Rapids Women's History Council has a landing page on our website. This includes a timeline which takes you through the whole movement. It also includes information on a Girl Scout badge that we helped develop that Girl Scouts can earn in suffrage. And it also has some national centennial sites that were developed for this year. So there is still some research to be done. It's an ongoing effort, but this is what we have for you today. So thank you again for having me today. I hope you're all inspired by the work of the women who came before us and the men in the suffrage movement to do your civil duty today and cast your ballot if you haven't already.
Awesome. Thank you, Katelyn.
Yeah.
I don't have any questions or comments yet in the chat. So if someone wants to type one in and or unmute yourself and ask Katelyn a question or comment, please feel free to do so. We have about 10 minutes.
I will say a question I often get is what's some terminology. So suffragette is actually the British term. In if they use that term in the United States, it was meant to be mocking of them. So they usually call them suffragists in the US.
Interesting.
Fun fact.
Well, we women owe a lot to them. They were bold, grateful.
Indeed.
Katelyn, would you like to share with us how what I believe it was Tennessee, the last state that allowed the 19th Amendment to actually happen? Do you remember the side story that went with that? With the gentleman who had switched his vote and why?
I actually don't know.
Oh, his mother called him.
Oh,
He had not intended. Do you know that one?
yes.
Okay, why
Yes.
don't you share it? It's a good story.
I had heard that. Yeah, so on the day of the vote, the youngest, he was the youngest, I believe. He was in his 20s. He was still unsure, and his mother called him on the day to say, "You better vote for suffrage," and he did, and won it for.
Okay, now we have a couple questions coming in. Let's see. One question is, were any of the local leaders in the movement jailed or otherwise harassed that you know of?
I don't know that they were in Grand Rapids. That's not to say they weren't. I just didn't come across it. I do know that some women traveled to DC for demonstrations, and they were jailed in DC.
Okay, thank you. Also, it says here that you told us that Grand Rapids supported the 1918 amendment. Do you know how Holland voted?
I don't know. I had spent a minute looking, try to find it, but I didn't find it before the
Okay.
presentation. Yeah.
Another question is, what are the originalists asking for? Doesn't this fly against the 19th Amendment?
Lori, if you're on, what do you mean by the originalists?
Lori Gosshorn, if you want to unmute yourself to explain your question further, go ahead.
It's just a term that I've heard recently, that there are a number of people wishing to return to the original form of the Constitution.
Oh, okay, I see. That's what okay. Yeah, I mean, if you return to the original form of the Constitution, women wouldn't have the right to vote. Neither would Black men. So it would definitely negate against the 19th Amendment. Or to hold office. Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. In Grand Rapids, were there the same tensions between the white suffragists and women of color seeking the vote?
There were, yeah, which actually that's an area we've identified as more research is needed. But we do know that there were separate organizations. A lot of Black women weren't in the Equal Franchise Club. So there were some tensions, yeah.
Right. Also, do you have any idea who funded the movement in Grand Rapids, like paying for their printing costs and things like that? Like where the money came from to help fund it?
That's a really great question. I'm not sure about that one either. I know they did a lot of fundraising locally. Yeah, they had fundraising committees, but I don't know who exactly underwrote it. No.
Okay. Let's see. American radical movement was never violent, as was the British, but there were some women from Michigan who split off from the main movement. I guess that's just a comment, not a question. But
Yeah, which there were some nationally there were splits between tactics where you have one line of women who are a little bit more say cordial, and you have some who favor more extreme tactics. So that was true of the suffrage movement throughout the 19th century, and it was also true in Grand Rapids. There were some disagreements about which tactics are most effective or ethical.
right. Still happening today.
Yep. Definitely you can see some of these threads coming forward into 2020. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. And then we just have a couple comments, Katelyn, saying thank you so much and how important it is for us to know this and to be reminded of this privilege. And thanking you for your presentation today. Those are great. Thank you, everyone. Anybody else have any comments or questions for Katelyn this morning?
It looks like Mary Voss said, how much influence did Anna Shaw have on the women in Grand Rapids?
Ah, okay.
She did have a fair amount. She did come to speak. She's from Michigan. So yeah, she definitely had some local roots. She didn't hold, she held national office, so she didn't hold the local office, but definitely.
Neat.
The League and Bill Wells, when was the League of Women Voters formed? I'm not going to hold to it, but I believe it was formed in 1918 or 1920.
It was formed between, I can tell you, it was actually formed by Carrie Chapman Kate, and she decided that as more and more women were receiving the right to vote, and it looked like there was hope that there would be a passage, she felt that there needed to be a way for people to become educated, especially women, about voting and what voting rights mean. So the League was formed 6 months before the 19th Amendment was ratified, and that was February 14th, 1920.
Thanks, Claudia.
Thank you.
Actually, in Michigan, the League, the League formed in Michigan in 1919. So yeah, the national had to wait until after 1920.
And then Michigan joined the national.
Exactly.
Great.
And since I butted in, I'd like to thank Katelyn. I'm with the Greater Grand Rapids Women's History Council also, and I'd like to invite you all to join a book discussion that we're hosting in 2 weeks. We did a discussion in September on exactly the Tennessee movement that you mentioned by Elaine Weiss, and the information is on our website. But we're discussing a book by Martha S. Jones, a leading African-American scholar, on November 18th called All Bound Up Together. And whether or not you've read the book, you'd be welcome to listen in. And it's about the development of African-American women in public life throughout the 19th century. And we know quite a lot about women in Grand Rapids in the 1890s also, who were suffragists.
Thank you.
Are
Awesome.
we through with questions, Kim, or do you?
I think so. I think so. Judy Parr shared in the chat with everyone about a amendment that was on the November 5 ballot here, so people can see that if they would like. Interesting info with some names of people, women from Hope Church who had signed it. So very good.
Katelyn, thank you. We really appreciated this, and it gave us a real reason why voting is important and how hard women and other people in our country have campaigned and worked to get the right to vote. So a good reminder of what Barb said to us this morning when we started. If you haven't already voted, please vote. Voting is what, remember, it's democracy is not a spectator sport.
It's not. Thank you so much, Claudia. Also, lastly, before we close, Katelyn, if you're able to email me at hasp@hope.edu, there's some folks that are interested in getting that link for the book discussion.
Absolutely. Yeah, we
Okay.
can send that out.
Great, and then I can too. Thank you so much.
Thank
Have a
you,
great day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.